want to talk about keys, in particular, keys for SSH. Keys for SSH can make our lives a whole lot easier because they can allow us to log into a remote machine without the use of a password, but they still provide a safe and secure connection for us. So the first thing we'll look at is the .ssh folder. Now, you may or may not have this yet, but the .ssh folder will eventually exist if you SSH into a remote machine, or if you do some other commands that we'll look at here in just a moment. But the known hosts actually is generated when you SSH to a remote machine. When you connect to a remote machine, it generates that known host file saying, after you acknowledge that you trust the remote host that you're logging into, it stores that so it doesn't have to ask you that anymore. And then IDRSA, which was not in that folder yet, but all these other files will eventually be in there. IDRSA is part of my key, and IDRSA.pub is also part of my key. Authorized keys, these are the keys that I've allowed to log in to my machine without the use of a password. Now, you need to do the reading in order to understand a little bit more about these keys, but a brief overview is to ensure cryptographic security, you can use what's called a public and a private key. The public key, or .pub, is used for locking or encrypting, and anyone can have that. The IDRSA is what's known as the private key. The private key you keep private and you don't let anyone else have it, and that is used for decryption. So, public key, anyone can ask for. A quick example is when I SSH into a remote machine, I will, and assuming I have this set up correctly, I will ask them for their public key, and I will use that public key to encrypt the data stream. And when the stream gets to the other computer, it will be decrypted using that RSA private key. Those are the general basics behind it. So, as we've said, the known host keeps a list of computers that we have already accessed. Keys are used for doing away with the password, and we already talked about that. Authorized keys keeps a list of the public keys from other computers. When a computer is in this list, you won't have to enter a password to access it. To put a computer in this list, the SSH copy ID command must be run on the other computer. Well, I'll show you that in a second. And there's an example of using a public and private key for encryption and decryption. You can read through that. Here's my example. So I want to go SSH to joe@yavin.cs.dixie.edu, and it prompts me for a password. I'm going to hit Control-C because I don't want it to. If I want it to do passwordless, let's try this. Copy ID. It says no identities found. So we first have to create our public-private key. SSH, oh yes, key gen. Says I'm making a public-private key pair. Do you want to do this? Yes, 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 yes. Now we can copy it. The key is over there now. You can see that it copied it over. Now it says SSH into this remote machine using this command, and I can copy that in. And now notice I'm on my remote machine without a password. If I log back out and look at the .ssh directory, you can see it created RSA, rsa.pub, and known hosts. The authorized keys file was modified on the remote machine because now Yavin authorizes me to log in without a password.